Hello, and welcome to the latest installment in our UXDX online series. I hope you're as excited as I am for the talks that we have tonight. But before we jump into those, I want to give a very quick introduction to UXDX and why we host these sessions. So at UXDX, our mission is to help companies shift from building software using waterfall or more commonly water scrum fall methodologies and using truly autonomous empowered product teams. And the reason why that's our mission is because in a high change environment, it's a more effective, efficient, and sustainable way of working. Now, why I mentioned high change was because if you're just in a company where you have a few projects a year, it makes sense. Build a team, work on whatever you're working on, disband them, and move somewhere else. But in a lot of companies I've been in recently, there's literally hundreds of projects going on at any given time. So all of that moving around isn't as efficient as having a team who really understand the customer needs, really understand the business needs, and can iterate in their kind of niche to be able to improve and ensure that they get the best product possible. Now, that's really easy to say, but it's really hard to do. So that's where these talks come in. And we invite people to come and share how they're changing their part of the product delivery process. It's too much to talk about the entire thing in one talk. So we ask people to share how they're changing their ways of working in their part of the process so that hopefully you can come up with some thoughts or ideas or questions on how you can apply that in your context. So that brings me to questions. So each of our speakers will leave some time at the end of their talk to open for questions. So please do feel free to ask them on whichever platform you're watching this on. So we'll collate those questions, whether it's on UXDX or other social platforms, and we'll put those questions to the speakers. Now, sometimes we can't get through all the questions that get asked. So we'll invite the speakers to the UXDX community Slack group. And in the Ask the Speakers channel, we'll post any of the questions that we don't have time to get through, and we'll ask the speakers to answer them there. But that's enough about me. You're not here to listen to me talk, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker of this evening. So our first speaker is Kelly Bowker, who is the Director of Design at EverQuote, and she'll be talking about everything is communicated, not comprehended. So I'd like to welcome Kelly to the stage. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. So I'm Kelly Bowker. I am the Director of Design at EverQuote, which is an insurtech company based here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I've been here for almost a year now, but I've been working in design for about 20 years. So the running theory about 10 years ago was that I was in grad school so that I could run away and start my own circus. While that never happened, I continued to participate in circus acrobatics as a hobby, and my home has become its own circus because I have 3 small children and a dog. Today, I'm going to talk about how everything around us is communicating, even if it's not a smart device, as we've become familiar with. So first off, let's align on what is communication. Communication, according to Merriam-Webster, is a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior, also an exchange of information. It's personal rapport. It's information communicated, transmitted, or conveyed, or a verbal or written message. There are 5 types of communication, which I will go into in more detail. Verbal, what I'm doing right now. Nonverbal, what I'm also doing through my body language. Written, which you see on screen, also visual, and then what you are doing of listening. At the end of the day, or actually the start of the day, we're all on autopilot. What I would like you all to kind of take away with is understanding what are your communication styles? What are your comprehension styles, your comprehension skills? Where are you strong? Where are you weak? How do you observe the world around you? And so I really hope you kind of take away to understand, where do you communicate verbally? How are those nonverbal cues, like your body language, used when you're disinterested, excited, nervous? When you're tired, when you're bored? Are you a good listener? Does that change over time? Can you write concise and clearly articulated messages? Are there barriers to how you communicate effectively, both personally and professionally? Is it part of your job? Maybe you're a copywriter, content strategist, product manager, engineer. Who's your audience? How do they comprehend what you're communicating? How do you comprehend it? And these all vary based on our backgrounds, our culture, our education, the language you use, the English, Italian, French, Spanish, or visual with sign language, or as those of us that are parents, the visual of our children having meltdowns, which all leads into our experience, direct, observed, those repetitive cues and patterns that we've been presented and have filled our minds and our mental models on how to interpret the world around us. So the communication types, the first two are verbal and nonverbal. So verbal are the words, the caliber, the complexity that we use. Are we speaking at a 8th grade and above level of reading and comprehension? Are we speaking at a 6th grade level in comprehension? And is that necessity for the audience or for ourselves? What's the structure, the order of those words, the length of those words, of those sentences, and the intonation, the tone, the pitch, the stress, the cadence. Am I talking faster because I'm really nervous? Or am I slowing down and trying to tell a story so that you can immerse yourself and understand what I'm trying to communicate? And the environment impacts how we communicate. Those nonverbal cues, the facial expressions, the posture, the eye contact, my hand movements, also the physical closeness is also nonverbal, which we are more used to personally with friends, family, pets. And when it happens in a non-familiar relationship, can trigger responses and questions of like, why is this person so close to me? They're talking very close for those of us that are familiar with Seinfeld, but also sometimes it's forced for those of us that are used to public transit and being on crowded metros and trains and buses. But then there's also in the professional area, those passive cues is the communication type is this seniority of the peer in the room trying to communicate something, is their experience, their role, the time that they're spending with me, the time it takes to do the communication, and then also that channel. Is it digital? Is it physical? Is it in person? Is it over Zoom? Is it virtual in some manner? Is it over the phone? And how do those environments, that ecosystem, impact the effectiveness of what we're trying to communicate and what we're trying to comprehend? The communication types. They're obviously written. I have my slides here. I also have my notes in front of me. Our goals for that written communication is to avoid avoid confusion, embarrassment, and also legal jeopardy. We have footnotes. We have the idea of contracts. We sign here, yes, I agree to cookies. No, I don't agree to cookies. Something that we need to be more aware of is in this digital age, our messages live on, perhaps in perpetuity. What's the risk to that? So when you're writing, remember, write well, write with intention, review it, evaluate it against intent and desired perception by your audience now and in the future. We obviously don't always have time for that or this foresight to think about what we want to be perceived as in the future. But if we're all a little bit more diligent in how we're communicating, what we're communicating, and why we're communicating with it, hopefully our end goals can meet the value that we're trying to get across, and the comprehension on our audience side move more in our direction as needed, as appropriate within the space or the product or service that we're trying to share. With visual we kind of anchor to this idea of, well, it's pictures, it's movies, it's billboards, it's ads, but it's more than that. The lighting in my room is visual. It can be dark, it can be color toned, it can change, and those colors imbue a certain type of information. I'm going to go to a nightclub and listen to jazz, and so the lighting of the space is communicating that it's supposed to be relaxing. I'm supposed to be paying attention to the stage. Similar with movie theaters versus my children go to school. The lighting of their rooms need to be bright and airy so that they can observe and hear and see and engage with their classmates and their teachers. The imagery of movies associated with sound, those patterns, those movement, all of the feedback notifications that we get, those are visual cues that we have been trained to consciously and subconsciously on what we expect. The color of a button being red, the color of a button being gray communicates whether it can be interacted with and it's an error or warning, don't pass go, or you can't interact with this. And at the same time, there's also around 20% of our population that can't inform or divest and understand what color is trying to use. So we need a combination of different types of communication types in order to be most effective in our messaging. Last, not normally considered as part of a communication type, but active listening. I learned the listening triangle from my grad school professor for negotiations intensive, Moshe Cohen. He wrote a whole book on the value of negotiations called Collywobble. So this is from him. I've used it effectively within research, sometimes effectively with my children, but definitely very effectively within my professional career. And so the reminder of this is provide your full attention to the other party. And the other party can be static report. It can be a book, but you are not going to be able to fully comprehend, to fully take in and evaluate that knowledge that you're getting if you don't give it your full attention. Sit with the information that you've taken with. Kind of evaluate yourself, question yourself. How am I interpreting what's being communicated to me? Is it effective? Is it not? Would it get value through additional artifacts, through graphs, through pictures, through sound? How can I get the most out of what I'm trying to take in from the other party? And then when it is a two-sided conversation or three-sided conversation with a group of people, communicate back what you think they're trying to tell you. Sit with that and then communicate back and say, I heard you say this, and this is how I'm interpreting it. The common example that I like to work with is, say you are the manager of a hotel, and the owner of the hotel comes stopping and into your office and says, we need 2 pools. Manager A is just like, okay, I'm being told I need 2 pools. I'm going to go planning board and figure out, how do I get in the second pool? Manager B is like, wait, why is he telling me I need 2 pools? And so you sit with it and you're like, okay, well, we have a pool. What about the current pool is not like meeting your expectations? Why are you running into here with this expectation and this desire and this order to have a second pool? And then through that conversation, going around and around through the listening triangle, you learn you don't actually need a new pool. He has a highly value important on like the business clientele who spend more money, who are more frequent than the family clientele. So you don't need a new pool. You need very clear pool hours. So you need a sign, you need rules, you need behaviors to change. And you get that through aligning on communication. So we're going to play a little game. I normally run this as a workshop, so virtual, we'll see how it does. Physical example. We have a traffic light. I'm getting told that it's green. The patterns that we grew up with, even if I am red-green colorblind, I should have learned by now that at least in most of the world, not Japan, the bottom circle is green and that means go, but the traffic's not moving. So what do? I lean on my horn. I am now giving a physical cue to my car that it needs to then give a verbal cue to the rest of the environment around me. Eventually, traffic moves and I see there was an accident. And then luckily nobody's severely hurt, but the person that then had the accident was a cyclist. Their helmet is giving them a nonverbal cue that their helmet is now damaged. They have to take that information in and make a decision. Do I go get a new helmet? Do I potentially have a concussion? Do I need to see the hospital? They are trying to make heads and tails of all of this feedback, all of this information swarming in at them through a nonverbal communication cue. Next. I love ice cream. I have children, but even if I didn't have children, I love ice cream. So this one has a written communication type. It has a nonverbal communication of here's the flavor, here's the cone, here's this physical object. You are then getting feedback as the person handing the child the ice cream of a successful experience because they're happy, they're smiling. Unfortunately, at some point, the ice cream drops. And then you're getting both verbal, visual, and nonverbal cues through there to understand that they are sad. And so then that is your cue to understand, to engage with them, to figure out how can you comfort them. Could you try and find out how to get another ice cream? Do you move forward because you can't get ice cream? What are the ways you take in all of this information unconsciously because of the patterns and experiences we've had in order to figure out how to move forward in order to have a successful end? Putting it in the professional space, as I said, I'm a director of design. I've worked as a product manager, I've worked in a variety of industries, but at the end of the day, whether I'm leading a team, I'm doing the design work, I'm partnering with product, I'm partnering with strategy, the point I always anchor to get across, to communicate to my peers, my stakeholders, my leadership, is that design at the root is the intentional arrangement of things to create a better experience and outcome. And that could be the arrangement of my desk and my space in my house. It could be in the arrangement of a workflow, of content on a page, the arrangement of a radio ad against other ads and communications in preparation for a sale or open enrollment, because we work in insurance, and other things like that. It's understanding the ecosystem and the order of operations and placing those in a way and accessible that makes the entire experience better for the business, because that's the business's goal, but also for the end user. How do I go about that the most? I leverage diagrams. Here is an activity diagram example that an old direct report of mine, Hannah, made. She found great success in aligning with engineers and product through using diagrams, because it takes away that bias and anchorage of the visual artifacts where things become very personal through the aesthetic preferences, and gets it down to more black and white types of decision making of what are the steps, what are the tactical steps, how long does it take there. So the example we used was Jane needs a less expensive way to light her business. She has a lot of different options to do that. How did she figure out that she needs the less expensive light her business? Through budgets, through communication. And so her options are either just like, okay, let me cut back on the usage. I'll change my hours. I just won't use this business space as often. I'll evaluate different electric providers. Is there a standard cap? Can I get discounts? What other areas? Or do I just switch the lighting? In addition to maybe the other two. It's not a one versus them type of scenario, but in this example, it's simplistic. So she looks at a different provider, she learns about pricing, and then has a decision point. Is the pricing less expensive? Yes. Happy path ideas. I enter my credit card, and then the website runs the card. We are skipping over the fact that she would have to kind of do the closing. So she has a comparison decision point, but this is very simplistic given the time here. Or she doesn't. So she needs to, exit the website and return to the start of that evaluative process, the understanding what cues, what's communicating to her, and how she can resolve that situation. On our side, our goal is to then use those diagrams, to use then those visual artifacts, to use that research to communicate to stakeholders, to design the full experience. So we're designing those activity diagrams, that processing, those steps, the capacity, the throughput line, understanding what are must-have engagement, what hasn't, using those kind of static and processes. Do we need to add in additional access to different types of support? Is the support automated? Are we using learning models? Are we using live people? Is there a time frame? We have to think about all of this both before and while we release our products and our services and our features. As designers, as product managers, we are building ecosystems. We are managing ecosystems. It is no longer the days of when I was early in my design career where I was designing brochures and it was a static thing. And once it got printed and mailed off, I had no more control over how the person engaged with it. I had some based on how I designed the pamphlets and the leaflets and the pages and the content, but it did not force a way to engage and obtain communication and understand the information we're doing with it or what to do. Within digital experiences, there's a lot more forcing functions, but there's also a lot more noise. And so I encourage all of you to be intentional with this work. So at the end, what I would like everybody to take away from with this in order to improve both your communication skills and your comprehension skills are self-reflection. The more self-aware you can be of your audience, who you're talking to, how you perceive your audience, how your audience perceives you, the content that you're providing, The format, the modes of communication. Is it written? Is it visual? Is it verbal? Is it nonverbal? Is it a light flashing? Is it repetitive? The channel, is it digital? Is it over the phone? Is it over radio? Is it word of mouth? Any other kinds of areas? The timing, the frequency. Do I set a schedule, a calendar for this communication to go over and over and over? What's the objective? Is there a lifespan to it? Also the behavior. There's the physical kind of behavior cues. There's also digital cues. How do we react when we get a message from our boss over Slack in email at like 10 p.m.? Are you reactive? Does it create a sense of nervousness and urgency? Or do you just turn off notifications so that you don't run the risk of that? At the start, you have to be first self-aware of how you engage with the world, how you communicate with the world. And then next, practice your writing skills, practice your verbal skills, practice your interpretation, ask for feedback, over communicate, especially in this digital world where we are more connected, but also more separate, given the remote environments, the Zoom calls, the Google Meets, all of these spaces that both make it easier to communicate and connect, which also makes us more passive and less engaged. Align with your partners, with your peers, with your stakeholders through that listening triangle. Give space and trust to respectfully disagree in order to then figure out what is it okay, or how to gain alignment or compromise in order to move forward, and document all of the processes going forward, the agreements, so that there's not confusion. Because again, we are overwhelmed with information every single day of the week, every single moment. And so if without that documentation, you run the risk of repeating those missteps, those miscommunications over and over and over again. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kelly. It was really interesting kind of take on, I guess, looking at a bit more of the science behind some things like user journey flows and that. So it was great. Thank you very much. So yeah, as I said at the start, if you have any questions, please do feel free to post them on whichever channel that you're watching this on, and I'll put those questions through to Kelly. But to get started, one of the things I always think about and I've done so many kind of be better at active listening and those kind of things, is when I'm communication is just such a natural thing for people that you don't even think of it as communicating. So I'm never intentional enough when I'm doing it. So do you have any tips or tricks that can kind of make people a bit more intentional instead of just slipping back into old habits?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been listening to more podcasts lately because my children are slowly older, so I can handle the noise, the continued noise in my head. And I was listening to a really great episode on Diary of the CEO about how we're getting ADHD wrong. And what stuck out to me is that we're distracted all the time. But the primary catalyst to distraction is our own internal need to avoid pain. And so that was eye-opening. It was like, oh, wait, yeah, I'm trying to avoid pain a lot. Like I escape into my phone and read articles in order to avoid the discomfort of like my children being loud. And so I've built those habits subconsciously in order to avoid pain and discomfort. And so it goes back to what I was saying of like self-reflection. If you can find time in a day, in a week, to like keep track of those moments where you got distracted internally, you start to recognize the external cues or events that lead to you kind of becoming disengaged. And sometimes it's by accident. At the start of every meeting, especially when I'm kind of solo parenting or something, I remind people, hey, like I have my phone on, I'm going to get distracted. It is just like, even if it's a moot point and obsolete, it's going to happen and I apologize. And so it's kind of that more transparent process of being honest with ourselves and with each other of we're inundated with distractions in order to help create a safer space to have that forcing function to get back on track. Because I think the risk now is more, to your point, like communication, do it. We're on autopilot. But if we don't feel more comfortable calling each other out, calling ourselves out for when we don't communicate effectively or we don't listen effectively, then it's going to continue down that negative path. And we're going to have less engaged relationships or less valuable relationships.
Yeah, I love that. It kind of, I love the phrase somebody told me before, they're an experienced beginner. And what they meant by that is they have a lot of experience doing something, but they're still a beginner at it because they've never taken the time of self-reflection, which is how you really learn, which is kind of, how did I do that? What could I do better? So at communication, a lot of us are experienced beginners.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't really until I started having children that I realized just how poor of a communicator I was. I could give my kids who are like elementary school age and my design team the exact same instruction of like, go make a picture of a building, and I would get vastly different results because of difference in skills, different of experiences, difference of mental models. My team might prod and be like, what kind of building? Is it eco-friendly? Is it Renaissance? Is it this? Whereas my kids are like, oh, here's a house. Here's a tree house. Here's like a rectangle. And that's just absolutely fascinating to me, is understanding just how big of an impact our experiences are, our subconscious frameworks have on our ability to effectively communicate and then comprehend the world around us.
Brilliant. The other thing that jumped to my mind when you were explaining kind of using a user journey flow as a tool for communication, do you always think, because you mentioned so many different forms of communication, I really like the concept of the Amazon 6-pager. I don't know if you're familiar with that,
Yep.
but they've actively advocated against PowerPoint and visuals and more for just dense text to kind of cover it.
Yeah, I have had to write the Amazon 6-pager. I have had to write essentially longer ones of that. I was interviewed recently on a podcast where I talk about this. I have had to write the longest papers when I was a product manager than when I was in grad school. I might at some point get a PhD and write a dissertation. And I love reading. It is one of my favorite hobbies. I hate reading documents in the professional world. Give me bullet points, give me lists, give me something that's scannable and digestible. Help me understand the meat of this, because there's only so many hours in the day. And the longer that I have to read, and if point A is at the start and then point B is like 3 pages down, my effectiveness on being able to connect those two goes down because my energy decreases over time. I think the act of writing those papers is a really effective tool, but expecting other people's to give the same amount of care and time and attention for all of those 6-pagers, especially when you think about the sizes of teams and who has to make decisions, it falls over pretty fast. And so I love PowerPoints. I love bulleted lists. I've used bulleted lists in like personal emails and have gotten called out by my mom and my aunts for it. Like, nope, this is for fluffy stuff. So that's where the point of know your audience, know yourself, know your perception of your audience and the audience's perception of you, because there are going to be times where it's just, that's the expectation of the job and you have to write it. And the act of writing it, I fully agree, is like helps you get better at then articulating the point when you're in the meetings later, because what is the likelihood that your peers, your stakeholders, once in the meeting to, thumbs up, thumbs down, or push for more information, have read all of those. They want those bullet points. And so like that then cements the information in your head more, because if you're practicing the content, it's all about like, where do you spend your time? Where's the risk? And then what is the expectation of those that are asking for the communication tool, for the artifact, for the document? I definitely warn my team on getting into visuals from a mock-up perspective, from an experience perspective too early, because then you always have somebody that anchors to something that was like a fluffy idea. And they're like, well, where was that star and the automation and things? And you're like, well, we don't have the infrastructure for it. It's a vision work, like sometime in the future. But we want it now. And so you have to play those politics and those battles. And that's why like documentation is key, but understanding what the usefulness, the utility, and the point of that documentation comes first.
Brilliant. Well, that actually brings us perfectly to time. So I just want to thank you once again, Kelly, for sharing your insights.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Great. So up next, our second speaker for this evening is Matthew Conti, who will be speaking about CI/CD for product designers. So continuous research, continuous development, and a path forward. So I'd like to welcome Matthew to the stage. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Conti. I've been an independent contractor and consultant for over a decade, originally starting in aeronautical design to international development to the military to much more. And so over the years, CI/CD has become more prominent as the industry has evolved and has become more mature. Kind of walking down a history lane of what CI/CD originally was back when webmasters were more prominent. It was a continuous improvement, continuous development process where webmasters were trained every 6 months to a year. They need to update their systems for security reasons and making sure everything is relevant and up to date. So over the years now it's become fully automated. Usually I like to approach things from like a level 1 to level 2 to level 3 CI/CD approach. But for product design, I definitely want to get into what continuous research and continuous development is for a product designer. So, research operations, research ops, for me that I have found to be a nice Goldilocks zone for research, primary and secondary, is breaking them down into 3 different buckets. Each one can be primary, secondary, or tertiary. Typically, users usually are the primary effect towards the implementation, utility, and usability of findings and implementation of solutions. So user research, which is more common these days, journey mapping, getting into personas, doing surveys, doing empirical or ethnographic research. It's a very common environment to gain IAO variables or interest, attitudes, and opinions. And then operations research is getting into the operational considerations. So I break that down into coulds, shoulds, wants, and needs. So based off of user input, secondarily, I will look into, from a policy perspective, a legal perspective, a doctrine perspective, is this something from a user perspective we can actually implement? Would it actually hurt our users, even though it might make it more effective for them or useful? Is there any bylaws or any legalese that we need to be considerate to? And then the market research elements, market trends and considerations of how even the updates to the system, application, software, anything in between is impacting the market, or the market is influencing us within our solutioning. So it's not really just, one size fits all of user input, but I think it's a triangulation of wants and needs, consequences and risks. So from a research operations perspective, especially when we know society constantly evolves asymmetric or asynchronous to how we implement. From a human-centric perspective, we are not going at the same pace as society is. So there's always trade-offs and considerations, primary, secondary, or third ranking consequences that take place based off of implementation and what that looks like within the roadmap and how you plan for it. But the great part of implementing research operations and continuous research into the process is really taking into account that no matter what, the ground that we are on is always shifting, evolving, adapting, and adopting to us, or vice versa. If you think of like ontological design, we shape the world and then the world shapes us back, right? So as we influence the world influences us in return. It's like MC Escher's hand for any artist out there. It's the hand that's drawing the hand, which is then drawing the hand. And then getting into the design operations of things, I like to break it down into 3 buckets as well. Single factor ideation or development, which is a one-to-one relationship. When you're thinking of single slice, segmented designs or implementation within the process to where it's not really touching on many different or impacting many different pieces to the puzzle. I generally think of that as a single factor design or ideation development thinking that you're taking into account. The next is multi-factor ideation, one-to-many relationship, meaning that it isn't involving all things, but it's involving things that are in the closest center of gravity towards that design process to troubleshoot, to problem solve, to think through, to chew on, to validate. Through all of this, you're dealing with a divergence and convergence of effects. And then full factor ideation, one to all relationships. How does this from a 360 view impact everything around us? Usually, when you get into a wider scale of relationships, you're dealing with specificity and sensitivity, usually because it's either very revolutionary, it's innovative, it's disruptive, it requires a lot of change. So think of single all the way to full factor. As you go from single to multi to full, it gets more complex, but also can become more risky, or you have to take in the challenges, the compliance and consequences to those things. And again, it's not one size fits all. When you're designing to something, you don't do it in broad strokes. Even when you're implementing a vision, the vision can also be distilled down into vertical and horizontal design and prototyping. Design thinking as a whole, I came from the background of design theory, right? You can't design think if you don't know what design is. So my foundations are in design theory, not design thinking, because then it helps me understand how you think about design. So instead of just bucketing into one like design thinking umbrella, as you, and I'm sure many people have gone through the design iterations and chewing on ideas, going back and forth with developers and things like that, is there's a push and pull, almost like a concentric circle and overlapping like Venn diagram of different types of how you think within that design process, whether it's design critique, design criticism, pluralistic walkthroughs, design workshopping, design studio. It's not predicated on just one element over any. They're all important. Some might consider visual design a subcategory of communication design, but it's all based off of the organizational structure and what makes the most sense to your workflow and process, which is all valuable and very useful, but each one has its own pockets of very robust and nuanced considerations and even philosophical nuances. So, from that design thinking practice, as we evolve and as applications have matured and maturated, or we put out a release, 6 months later, 3 months later, okay, now that we've gotten to this point, where are we now? How do we think about users now? Did we meet our mark? Because of certain limitations, because of our infrastructure, let's get user research going again, or operational research or market research, and think about how can we further synthesize this for the sake of our users and putting them first. So these different pockets of design thinking are ubiquitous within the whole entire continuous development process, and even within a CI/CD practice. The next one is systems thinking. I usually don't apply just design thinking. I think in systems theory. Again, I come from a systems theory perspective. What is a system or systems? In order for me to think about it, systematically. So you have information systems, decision support systems, branding systems. Sometimes they're design systems, right? Management systems thinking, workflow, product service systems. Some of these may overlap, but it's to show you that it's not one size fits all, and it can be very nuanced, right? If you use specific types of components libraries, or ones that are not fully refined, while some components are more detailed, and more thorough, are they one-offs? Are they repeated patterns. How are you taking those user interface conventions and supporting it systematically? And how does that product versus service correlate? And how those workflows all come to be is very important. I know that if you're applying like Conway's law, right? We create a system or an application that reflects the organizational psychology of our day to day, right? And when you think of models, right, and you're getting into like human model interaction or model-based engineering or model-based decision making, kind of what you were showing with the user journey flows, right? Those are mental models for people to act upon systematically, but it's not necessarily predicated on just a blanket system. It's pertaining to specific nuances of how that user journey is to operate systematically in a holistic perspective, divergently or convergently, for that matter. So this is to give you a more broken down distillation of that. Don't limit yourself to what you've already done, and think about scale and scope. How can you build out more, but also how can you build out pockets of unique and novel ideas as you're building the further foundation and activity-centered considerations through the process. The holistic immersion elements between the research ops and design ops practice, we don't bring this into the full gamut of what divergent and convergent thinking really pertains to, whether using single diamond or double diamond design thinking, right? When you're bringing in things, whether it's research-based, whether it's design-based, whether it's development-based, whether it's management-based, is when you start blending that stuff together, pushing and pulling, having the conversations, having the tough messages being relayed. Is it being communicated effectively? Are we getting past the finish line? Do we have all the needs that are there for us to execute in the way we'd like to? Is when you bring that stuff together, is you're getting into lateral thinking and futures thinking, right? So, laterally thinking means you're getting creative, right? You're getting creative about how you're implementing things and in what kind of way. Like what makes sense, what doesn't. What is the intention? What is the purpose? What deadlines do you have to meet? What does the user now feel now that that's what we've implemented? How can we creatively still solve their problem, even though that we've already delivered it? Now we have a release in 3 to 6 months. What can we do now? And then, and along the same line is futures thinking. Okay, this is where we are right now. We've implemented everything from a user perspective to a T, operationally market related. It's going to help us better position ourselves competitively, but also meet user interests. What can we do now with users involved, stakeholders involved, and people involved, and deliver something into the future beyond where we are now? So it's getting more imaginative, thinking of like blue sky, green pastures. How can we now take all of these dynamics in the process? Some of that gets into experimentation. We get into like DOE, right? Design of experimentation. And some of that deals with, a discriminant reliability, where you don't have all the data points you need, where you might think of it as, envisioning what it may look like, even though you don't have the necessary data points to make it valid. You have inter-rater reliability, where you have some exposure to what could be reliable, but not. You don't have complete validation on all considerations, but let's say you're 50% there, or 60-40, or 70-30, or 20-80. You have some semblance of validation and reliability to that. And then you have complete internal reliability, even within futures thinking, to where we know where we can take this down the road. We know the users love it, because even though this might be a new implementation, we've been following the empirical research or ethnographic research for the past 8 months, and know that this could be exactly what we need, right? Or, even getting into the A/B testing, right, and gathering secondary research, getting into pair testing, getting into split testing, and doing all of these different ways to measure effectiveness qualitatively and quantitatively. So, as CI/CD has come to full fruition and it's more automated now, even though CI/CD has been practiced for several years, is that now as product designers, now that we have these automated systems, the next step is, okay, we got to make sure that we're continuously developing our designs to evolve to our user ecosystems and our communities, because they're moving at a different pace than we are. They have different affordances. They have different sentiments towards our application, 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, right? And, they say like you can easily underestimate what you can do in a year, but then you can completely overestimate what you can do in 10, right? So as you are, implementing and automating and building out all of these things from a engineering perspective, development perspective, the product designer's responsibility now is to evolve that product. Sometimes it's leaning out things if it's too costly, and making sure that we're downscaling in appropriate areas because it's not as effective. You don't just lean out, within process, but you can also lean out within your application, product, or service as well. But that's the necessary trade-offs towards making sure that you always meet operational user and business interests, but more so importantly, you're staying modern. You're staying as a zeitgeist to the industry. So the benefits overall, like I was kind of discussing a little bit, is having a continuous research and development process, using research ops and design ops as the segue towards the necessary conversations between product management, design, and development, because it's never over. The CI/CD pipelines now afford you the opportunity, more so than ever before, to consistently look into user interests primarily, but also think about the operational benefit of making sure you're always meeting market and user needs. And then the acculturation, advancement of a more human-centered design. There's certain designs out there, there's certain websites out there, certain applications that are 5 to 8 years old that are just not doing their job as much as they used to, and yet they're not really trying to change. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel. They're not trying to address more common user interests or demands from telling what the market says. And so it can't be human-centered design if it's not human-centric anymore, because the dynamics of the landscape of the community, as society, as technology, as the ecosystems around us all are moving at a different pace. You can easily fall into something that was once human-centric to something that no longer makes sense. And so that's what CI/CD has afforded us as product designers, is always looking into how can we do this better, and where can we think abundantly and with a growth mentality within our services currently. But also the further proliferation of human-centered computing. This is more common now than it was in the past, but getting into HCC and taking into account how developer experience is just as important too as the user experience and design, right? And human-centered computing is bringing in the information systems management, the business science, the industrial and organizational psychology in with computation, and building out the necessary model-based decision-making that's necessary for human model interaction. And model essentially means overall, like let's say you're using Agile, DevOps, let's say you're applying Six Sigma or some other practice, right? Is human model interaction is users and society as a whole interacting with you as an organizational structure, to say the least, but also that is so deeply rooted into your day-to-day that your updates all the way down to how your process is directly correlated and impacted by user needs and interests and wants. So what that does is it furthers new and innovative ways to discover and execute novel, nimble, or noble ideas, to where you're not so rigid on, okay, well, we can only do it this way, or we've already done it. Okay, it's a one-off. We don't have to worry about it anymore. Thankfully, the CI/CD pipelines have now given us the opportunity for us to always think forward and to fail forward and to experiment and get into purposeful play like you need to, because that's really what it's there for. You don't need a CI/CD pipeline if it just stays the same, right? So that's what it's given us as product designers, and to be able to see us as an ongoing process within the design ideations, the development considerations, how we manage and strategize. It's completely changed the design strategy overall, in the fact that you're not going from a waterfall perspective, but as it was shown with the diagram with the UXDX life cycle, that it's constantly going in perpetuity and is like a living process that never ends. And that's how you think, if you're applying like game theory, it's an infinite game, right? You don't think just, okay, now it's here and that's it. There's great disruption. There's a lot of sustainable innovation, whether it's recombinant or endogenous, that can take place within that. And you can contact me on LinkedIn at Artist Conti, and thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matthew. Really kind of almost a technical view of how to incorporate design into a CI/CD pipeline. So, and it used a lot of graphics, which is kind of touching on the last conversation as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. So just to remind everybody out there, if you do have any questions, please feel free to post them on whichever channel that you're watching this on, and I'll put them through to Matthew. The first question I had, and it's a term I've never come across before, but the multi-factor and full factor ideation. Can you give me some examples of those to kind of make it a bit more tangible? What are the differences in your mind between those three different elements?
Yeah, let's say you have a use case, right, where you have to submit a form, right? And you put all of your information in there, first name, last name, email, like you're setting up, let's say, a profile, or you're setting up an account, right? First name, last name, and creating a username and password, right? You submit that, right? But then it creates your profile. That's one factor. That's like a single factor, right? But then let's say it shoots out an email saying, okay, now that you've got this, we need to get a confirmation email saying that this is the correct email. We got that. Okay, now that we have that, we now have to put in like, let's say we have to now set up like multi-factor authentication. Now that that's happened, or you have the option to enroll in it when you sit there and confirm your email, so like, even though you're just creating essentially your credentials, it then can lead into these different factors that you're taking into account, right? And let's say when they submit the confirmation email to you, you select confirm email. Let's say then it auto populates what you see in society, where all of a sudden you're signing up for subscriptions to their email list, right? So then you're taking all of those different considerations just from one instance of just creating someone's profile or login credentials, right? Full factor is getting into like, we can use the same instance, right? But then once they have all of those credentials, if you have MFA, then you're getting into like single sign-on, right? So where all of a sudden you can now have access to like 5 different applications like Okta or something, like some type of tool that allows you to sign into multiple different applications. And then those credentials branch out into all of the different applications as well. And then what those do is you have to set up, let's say, different types of validation for those as well. So it's all a level of magnitude, right? And how that impacts the greater scale, like the splash, like I call it. Like if you're creating something that completely revolutionizes a ticketing system in an application, the more advanced or more complex it is, even though it might not look very complex. I've worked with designers and researchers in the past to where it might not look like a complicated implementation, or it looks very like cutting edge, but then you realize the ripple effect it has across multiple different areas of your system, or system of systems, or a product of products, right? Especially if you're getting into these architectures that you have a one-to-many or many-to-many relationship. And so it's never just like you design just for design's sake, which is great. You should, but you also have to think about the associated risks. But hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. I love the just give me an account feature, because that's a brilliant one of, like, as you said, okay, so now we need to validate your email. But wait a sec, what happens if somebody's trying to use the system and they haven't validated their email? Like, how does that account that's partially validated, like, how does that work? And what about if they forget their password? And what if they, like, so it just keeps rippling on from what seems like potentially a simple request.
Yeah, absolutely. It's you have what you know what you don't know, but then you don't know what you don't know. And it's kind of like the it's a triangulation of the three. It's like, okay, now that we've done this, from a primary perspective, now secondarily from a research perspective, or primary or secondary design ops perspective, like now that we've done that, how do we validate to make sure we're covering all user needs? Right? Like if someone says, I wish, when I create my sign-on credentials, I just want to make it easy. Like, I'm sure people have heard that response. What does easy mean, right? To communication, everything's communicated but not necessarily comprehended, right? Is that, just make it easy. But what does that mean? Oh, well, send out the email, like make it simple. Like, we don't have to go searching for anything in particular. So the cost and benefit to that is never one size fits all, unfortunately. But it's also that sometimes the novelty is challenging assumptions too. Like, let's say we do that just knowingly. Are we missing any good ideas? In the process.
Yeah. No, it's a great kind of run through. I have another question. We might just have a little bit of time.
Okay.
One of the things that I was kind of watching is all of those different steps. Do you have a process or any kind of techniques for workshopping ideation, or for doing these steps that make sure that you're touching on all of those different elements?
Yeah, I always like to advocate, and this can be, hopefully it's taken in jest, it makes a lot of sense. Is the human-centered elements, human-centric design or human-centric computing. Sometimes the process also needs to be human-centric, right? And so there's been instances where I'm having to create a process specifically based off of those needs. But, for me, I do have like toolkits. I have frameworks that I use. I have research templates that I've created myself, but no, business, no organization, no entity should ever feel like there's one way of doing it. And I would say that they should create toolkits or processes that are defined by their models, and the way that their ecosystem structured, because not everyone might use what they need to, the way that others want to. So I would just have to say that don't feel limited to one way of doing something, as long as that you're solving the end goal. Because usually, from a design perspective, we're out to solve problems. We're not out to necessarily like at least when I grew up and I got my degree in fine arts, right? There's a process that I studied called process art, where it wasn't about the final outcome all the time, even though it's very important. The process itself was a form of artistic expression, right? So take that as an opportunity for you to create a CRCD process for CI/CD for product design in a way that makes sense for your organization and the way that your organization is structured.
Great. I love that analogy. So that actually brings us to time. So thank you very much, Matthew, for sharing.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. So that brings us to the end of our event for today. But if you did like the talks and you like the concept of bringing together product, UX, design, and dev into a single product team, because our kind of motto is you can't learn separately and then be expected to work together. So we tried to bring everybody together, and we're hosting an event in Dublin in October. 50 speakers, 12 workshops, 2,000 attendees, and unlimited experiences. So if you did enjoy the event tonight, please do consider joining us in Dublin. And if not, I look forward to seeing you at the next UXDX online event. Thank you very much.